Great. Okay, so it looks like, I was just looking at the program of the series of seminars, and it looks like this and next week, this Celtic Research seminar series is going to be offering Ogham galore, because there's my paper today, and then there's Nora White's next week on multimedia Ogham and digital epigraphy. And I think there's some synchronicity here, but I also have to admit that the project Nora is working on, which is co-led by my colleague here in Glasgow, Professor Kate Forsyth, is what got me thinking again about the receptions of the Ogham in contemporary fantasy. So this is a great opportunity for me to bring together some threads I touched upon a little in my 2017 monograph, and also explore some new ideas. So the topic of my paper is the Ogham script, and how modern fantasy continues to find it an enduring inspiration for inventing processes of divination, healing, and powerful magic. And also, actually, the chains of transmission from an ancient script to the way it has reached modern fantasy, not always through a very reliable route. And I suppose, as per usual, when giving such papers on Celtic echoes in modern fantasy, I find myself in a bit of a conundrum. I'm addressing a mixed audience here. I'm quite aware I saw some names that I recognized in the audience, and this is definitely a mixed interdisciplinary audience. So some of you will know all there is to know about Ogham, most definitely more than me, or at least enough about them to get by without much introduction. But you might not know much about fantasy tropes and expectations, and maybe the specific texts I'm going to talk about today. Others of you will probably know the fantasy texts I'll be using as case studies today really well, and many more examples besides, and will recognize the patterns of adaptation of things ancient and medieval that the genre often relies upon. But you may have not heard anything about Ogham, apart from perhaps Terry Pratchett's humorous take, and more on that later. So I'm going to have to provide some sort of key background on both Ogham and my fantasy texts, just to ensure all of you can follow what I'm trying to argue here, without losing you in the process. So let's see how that goes. So starting with Ogham, and first of all, the dual orthography and the dual pronunciation, right? So when it's spelled O-G-A-M without the H, this is the old Irish spelling and should be pronounced as Ogham, which is what I've been using so far. And I'm going to stick to that, I think, today, the old Irish pronunciation. When we spell it with the H, this is the modern Irish pronunciation and should be pronounced Ogham. So yes, I will stick to Ogham for today. And the Ogham letters are Irish. They're clearly inspired by the Roman alphabet, but they're quite independent from the Roman alphabet, both visually and conceptually. As you can see on the screen, they're made up of bundles of 1 to 5 short parallel strokes, a bit like a barcode, adjoining a central stem. Ogham in inscriptions are usually inscribed vertically, just as you see them here, on the edge of a stone and read from bottom to top. There are 20 original Ogham letters arranged in a fixed order in 4 groups. So to the right of the stem, to the left, obliquely across and on the stem. And when we have the sort of horizontal writing, then it's above or below. The earliest evidence of Ogham usage we have is in inscriptions in the 5th and 6th centuries. Around 400 Ogham inscriptions can be found carved on otherwise undecorated stone pillars across Ireland and all the Irish-speaking regions of Britain. And this is a lovely distribution map here, so you can see all the dots of where the stones are. So in Ireland, they're found mostly in Munster, especially County Kerry and County Cork, but we also find examples in Scotland, Isle of Man, Wales, Devon, and Cornwall. As far as we know, there are no Ogham inscribed stones in Brittany or elsewhere in the European mainland. The Ogham inscriptions on standing stones served as memorials and or boundary markers, as well as indicators of land ownership. So the content of these inscriptions is very practical and not literary in any way. The pattern is to usually have a male personal name in the genitive case with a patronymic or a familial affiliation. So let's just see one example here. This is an Ogham stone from County Kerry, one of a series of them, a number of them together actually. You can see the translation of the inscription in bold here. So so-and-so, son of so-and-so, descendant of so-and-so. That's the sort of pattern we see, a series of names and genitives. The photo is lovely, which I've got here, but I also wanted to give you a sense of the three-dimensionality of the stone and the writing around it. So we'll use a link, if it works, let's see, bear with me. We're going to use a link to the amazing Ogham in 3D project to manipulate the stone around space a bit. So I might have to stop sharing this now and share the other thing. Let's just see. Yep, okay. Right, hopefully you can all see this now. So I'm going to load the 3D model. There you go, let it get a bit sharper. There you go. So there's that same stone we saw in the photo, and you can see me moving it here. And you can see that the writing would go from bottom to top. And I'm going to move it around. So you see it goes all around, and then continues all around the other side over here. So yeah, hopefully you've been able to see all of this, and it's not just you staring on a blank screen, but there we go. So again, I'll stop sharing this and go back to the PowerPoint now. Okay, and we were there. Okay, so the use of Ogham inscribed stones actually declined after the 7th century, but knowledge of Ogham was never really lost. The script actually continued after the 7th century and evolved into a manuscript tradition. And here are several varieties of Ogham illustrated in the Book of Ballymote. Manuscript Ogham is written left to right in 2 dimensions on a horizontal stem line, and a key to Ogham is often supplied in these manuscripts, indicating that its general usage was in decline, perhaps. And each of the Ogham characters at this stage also gets a name that was a meaningful word in Irish. Some Ogham letters have tree names like birch tree or oak or hazel. And this is where the mistaken assumption that the Ogham are a tree alphabet comes from. We'll come back to that. Actually, only 6 of the 20 were originally names of trees. Examples of other Ogham names are neck or field, so clearly not trees. And it's not clear how old the letter names are. Are they contemporary with the manuscript tradition? Are they older? It's unclear. The manuscript tradition also includes a 5th group of supplementary characters of Ogham. So here I also have a page from one of the manuscripts of the Scholar's Primer. I'm not going to try and pronounce the Irish title here, but this is really a sort of a scholarly treatise on the Ogham in manuscript. And on the right, there's a couple of pages from the 1917 George Calder edition and translation of this text. And actually, this is the exact copy that J.R.R. Tolkien owned. I know many of you will know me as a Tolkien scholar. I'm afraid there won't be much Tolkien in this paper, but I had to find a reason to include him. He clearly was interested enough in Ogham to purchase this book. It's actually dated 1917 in his hand, so he bought it soon after it was published. And I'm probably stretching the evidence here a bit, but we also know that Tolkien invented a particular variety of one of his Elvish scripts in 1918 to 20, so not that long after he bought this book. This alphabet was called the Alphabet of Rumal, and some samples of it look like this. Now, the characters here, I think, are too cursive to look anything like Ogham, which are straight lines, really. And they're also supposed to be read, the Tolkien's examples are supposed to be read top to bottom rather than the other way around. But there is that vertical stem that makes me wonder. We know that there are lots of Tolkien linguistic papers we haven't seen yet. They haven't been released or sort of published. So who knows, we may still see direct evidence of Tolkien's creative engagement with Ogham. Right, now, use of Ogham didn't stop here, but continued sporadically into the later Middle Ages, the early modern period and beyond. You could say, the script is still used today in art, in sort of, you see it in tourist items sometimes. But in the post-medieval period, and with the eventual rise of antiquarianism, romantic nationalism, and Celtomania in the 18th and 19th centuries, all sorts of new imaginative views and interpretations were imposed upon the Ogham, often connecting them with a host of other romantic views about the Celts, their history, archaeology, and mystical beliefs and secrets. So this is the time I'm talking about. This is the time where antiquarians such as John Aubrey and William Stuckley argued that circles of standing stone, such as those in Stonehenge and Avebury, were temples of the ancient Druids. Those monuments are, of course, considerably older than the Celtic-speaking peoples of Britain from the Neolithic or Bronze Age, actually. So, this is also the time when Scottish poet James Macpherson published epic poems supposedly translated from ancient Gaelic manuscripts written by the mythical bard Ocean, who's depicted in the middle here. But Macpherson couldn't produce his manuscript sources when asked. And this is also the time when Welsh Iolo Morgannwg, who you can see on the right, recreated the ancient bardic tradition of Wales by fabricating medieval manuscripts. Now, Iolo's intervention is particularly important for our purposes. It seems like there was a bit of a case of romantic envy, I think I've chosen to call this here, a bit of a case of romantic envy, when Iolo claimed he had found in an old manuscript, read invented, a forgotten Welsh bardic alphabet called Coel Brenny Beirdd, literally lots of letters of the bards. And here's a table of that script, of Iolo's script, from a later book. Now, these symbols look more like the Old Norse or Old English runes rather than the Ogham, and they were written left to right on horizontal lines, on sticks, presented actually in a wooden frame known as a paithin, and you can see it here on the image on the right. But Iolo's system followed the Ogham in that it consisted of 20 basic letters, which he then supplemented by 20 other letters for long vowels and mutations, because, you know, this is Welsh we're talking about. I should also say that many enthusiastic scholars and antiquarians of the time were eager to accept Iolo's alphabet as the Welsh version of the Ogham. By that point, the craze for Druidism had already connected the Ogham with the Druids, so the Welsh bards could now claim their own equivalent. Now, this syncretism between authentic material, such as the actual Ogham, spurious links, such as this entire fad about Druids, often stretching to breaking point references in classical and medieval Irish texts, and complete inventions like Iolo's, is the very state in which many modern fantasy writers found a host of fascinating ideas to be inspired by. And inevitably, they found them not in hefty scholarly volumes, but in popularized adaptations. And one of the most important linking texts between the actual scholarship and the fantasy creativity was, and many of you have guessed this already, because I go on about this text a bit, usually, that's The White Goddess by Robert Graves. Yes, that highly eccentric, to put it mildly, but also wildly popular text of mythological imagination. So we'll return to Robert Graves, but for now, let me just give you a quick summary of his main thesis in The White Goddess, because that will have a bearing on what I'm saying later. So Graves' main thesis was that primitive societies in the Mediterranean originally worshipped a triple goddess in her manifestations as maiden, bride, and hag, corresponding with the phases of the moon. Male gods, said Graves, were subordinate to her, being her sons, lovers, and sacrificial victims, and all true poetry originated from telling a part of this primeval story. The goddess was once dominant all over Europe, claimed Graves, and beyond, but eventually was supplanted in many of these cultures by male gods who usurped her rituals and tales and effaced her worship. But, Graves argued, remnants of this goddess worship continued to be transmitted secretly, well after Christianity actually, by medieval bards, supposedly the inheritors of the wisdom of the ancient Druids. And Graves used Irish and Welsh material extensively to support this view, including the Ogham, as we will see. So, hopefully, as I said, I haven't lost you all by now in terms of the Ogham introduction. Let's move on to modern fantasy at last. So the two texts I want to start with are both from the boom of children's fantasy in the 60s and the 70s. So post-Robert Graves, but also post-Tolkien, and often with a clear direction to find mythological intertexts that hadn't been done to death by that point, in the way that Tolkien's immediate sources, mostly Old and Middle English, were perceived to have been bags, to have been done already by fantasy at that point. And I'm talking here about Susan Cooper and Lloyd Alexander. Susan Cooper was, of course, taught by Tolkien at Oxford, but very specifically engaged with the Celtic tradition, building upon her own family links with Wales. Lloyd Alexander was stationed in Wales during World War II, and later on talked about his discovery of Welsh mythological material, such as the Mabinogion, as a, quote, tremendous gold mine of fantasy, unquote, an untapped resource, so something that hadn't been done. So starting with Susan Cooper. Susan Cooper's reference to Ogham is fleeting, to say the least, but worth bringing up because it points to the kind of pan-Celticism much modern fantasy has adopted, a remnant of the Romantic period and actually 20th century scholarship. In the first and the third books of her Dark is Rising sequence, Of a Sea Under Stone and Greenwich, we see the standing stones of Kemah Head. The standing stones are not inscribed with Ogham, which is what, most people see this sort of cover and think, okay, maybe that's where it is. But in a sea cave underneath the stones, Simon, Jane, and Barney Drew, under the guidance of the mysterious Merriman Lion, find the Grail, an artifact of the light and also ultimately connected with the Holy Grail of Arthurian legend. The Grail is lost and then recovered again in the third book, and the mysterious manuscript that is supposed to accompany it falls in the hands of the children too. And here is the scene when that manuscript is first encountered. Very slowly and with immense care, Merriman drew the rolled manuscript from the little leaden case. It was covered with 2 blocks of heavy black marks. The children stared, dismayed, chasing horror over their faces. But it doesn't say anything. That's not even a language. It's gibberish. Jane said slowly, more cautious, "What is the writing, Gummery? Is there any kind of alphabet like that?" She looked without hope at the series of black marks, upright strokes, slanting strokes, single and in groups, like the random doodling of a tidy madman. "Yes," Merriman said, "there is an ancient alphabet called Ogham, not intended for a kind of writing. This is something like that, but still it is a half-writing, a cipher. Remember, it cannot mean anything until we have the Grail. It was written to go with the inscription on the Grail, to show its meaning plain. The one will give light to the other." So here we have a sort of half Ogham, a set of upright strokes, slanting strokes, single and in groups. This description makes them sound very much like Ogham, but which cannot be read till the script in the manuscript and the engravings on the Grail itself can be considered together. When they are eventually read together, what is revealed is the rest of the quest that the Drew children, as well as Will Stanton and another boy they will meet soon, have to embark upon to muster the forces of light and defeat the dark. Of course, by this point, we know that Great Uncle Merry, Gummery as the children call him, Merriman Lion, is actually, or was once, Merlin, King Arthur's own guide and counselor. And Arthur himself and his kin will be making an appearance in the remaining books. That the Grail and its accompanying manuscript are invested with an Ogham-like alphabet, which here seems to serve a cryptographic purpose, right? It's allowing only those who can decipher the code to find out how the quest can be won. Seems to me to chime very well with these romantic ideas associated with druids and bards communicating via secret languages and forgotten alphabets. We have here a sense of pan-Celticism too, this rather facile conflation of all Celtic-speaking cultures, so Irish material and Welsh and Scottish and Cornish all sort of mixed together, fused together to give an impression of a homogeneous Celtic culture, something which is as much a fantasy as the story itself. Modern scholarship, while still fruitfully drawing connections between Celtic-speaking cultures, is also very aware of individual traditions, practices, and artifacts. Right, so druids or bards associated with mystical writing are also present in Lloyd Alexander's Prydain series. Here we are in an immersive fantasy which builds an entire imaginary world, which is though very closely modelled upon Wales. So there's the map of Prydain on the left, the map of Wales on the right, you draw your own conclusions. So yeah, lots of links there, both geographically and narratively. And my book examines in detail key motifs from the Mabinogion that Lloyd Alexander adapted. The example I'd like to focus on here is a particular method of divination used in this series, which seems to blend the Ogham letters and perhaps Yolos Coelbren. Yolos Alphabet. One of the memorable animal characters in the series is Hen Wen, the oracular pig. She comes from one of the Welsh triads, actually, her name. She has the power to foretell the future. But in order to offer a prophecy, Hen Wen needs the letter sticks, wielded by the wise old man and enchanter Dalben. Dalben is another sort of Merlin figure, advising the High King of Prydain. But he's also very much imagined as a romantic druidic figure. He's the keeper of ancient wisdom through possessing the Book of Three. In the earliest draft of the first book in the series, he's even portrayed to be in possession of a mistletoe sickle, an apparatus of the Druids according to classical sources, and one that has stuck, in popular depictions. You see it in Asterix, right? We first hear of Dalben's letter sticks, through which he becomes the conduit for Hen Wen's prophecies, at the very opening of the first book. But Hen Wen escapes her pen before the sticks can be fetched, and following the runaway pig drives much of the plot of that first book. But in the very last book of the series, The High King, at a time of dire need for Prydain, Dalben attempts once more to obtain wisdom from Hen Wen, and this time the reader sees this divination practice on stage, so to speak. And here it goes. On his bony shoulders, Dalben bore the letter sticks, the ashwood rods carved with ancient symbols. As Dalben entered the enclosure and planted the letter sticks upright in the earth, Hen Wen snuffled and crouched closer against the bars. Dalben, murmuring inaudibly, moved to stand beside the ashwood rods. Outside the enclosure, the companions waited. Hen Wen whimpered and did not stir. "What does she fear, Elon?" we whispered. Taran made no answer. His eyes were fixed on the aged enchanter in his wind-whipped robe, on the letter sticks and the unmoving form of Hen Wen. This was the first time Taran had seen the enchanter seek a prophecy from the oracular pig. Of Dalben's powers he could only guess, but he knew Hen Wen and knew she was too terrified to move. Dalben glanced uneasily at Gwydion. Never before has Hen Wen refused to answer when the letter sticks were shown her. Taran then tries to calm down the clearly very agitated Hen Wen, who tries to do what she's asked, but remains pretty scared. Hen Wen paused at the first rod. Still hesitant, she pointed with her snout at one of the carved symbols, then at another. Dalben, watching intently, quickly wrote on a scrap of parchment the signs the oracular pig had indicated. Hen Wen continued a few moments, then suddenly left off and backed anxiously from the stick. Dalben's face was grave. "Can this be so?" he murmured, his voice filled with alarm. No, we must learn more than that." He glanced at Taran. Despite his words, Taran feared Hen Wen would turn away. She shook her head, squinted her eyes, and grunted piteously. Nevertheless, at his pleading, she cautiously trotted to the second rod. There, in desperate haste, as if to make an end of it quickly, she pointed to other symbols. The enchanter's hand trembled as he wrote. "Now the third one," he said urgently. But at the third one, things go wrong. Hen Wen, stiff-legged, reared back and sank to her haunches. All of Taran's soothing words would not budge her for several moments. At last, however, she rose and more fearfully than ever trotted to the final ashwood rod. Even as Hen Wen approached, and before she could point to the first letter, the ashwood rods shook and swayed like living things. They twisted as though to uproot themselves, and with a sound that ripped the air like a thunderclap, they split, shattered, and fell to earth in splinters. Hen Wen, squealing in terror, flung herself backwards and fled to a corner of the enclosure. Right, what's going on here? What I think we seem to have here is a strange combination between the Ogham and Iolo Morgannwg's Colbrany Beirdd. We know Lloyd Alexander read The White Goddess, so he would have known about the Ogham from that source at least. We also know that he read Lady Guest's translation of the Mabinogion, and that's at least one source from which he would have known about Yolos Alphabet, because Lady Guest included extensive notes on each of her Mabinogion tales, including one on the supposed mythological origins of Iolo's made-up alphabet. So this is Lady Guest's note, the one that Lloyd Alexander read. In the Abergavenny Prize essay on the genuineness of the Colbrany Beirdd or Bardic alphabet, by Mr. Taliesin Williams ab Iolo, that's actually Iolo's son, there is a curious allegorical tale which connects Menw with the discovery of that alphabet. The substance of the tale is as follows. Einigan Gawr saw 3 rays of light on which were inscribed all knowledge and science, and he took 3 rods of mountain ash and inscribed all the sciences upon them, as it should seem in imitation of the 3 rays of light. And those who saw them deified the rods, which so grieved Einigan that he broke the rods and died. And after the space of a year and a day, Menu ap Teir Gawath saw 3 rods growing out of the mouth of Einigan, and upon them was every kind of knowledge and science written. Then Menu took the 3 rods and learned all the sciences and taught them all, except the name of God, which had originated the Bardic secret, and blessed is he who possesses it. And Lady Gaston continues with that sign. It may be remarked, she says, that the Bardic symbol is formed of 3 radiating lines, which, it is said, are intended to represent the 3 diverging rays of light, which Einigan Gaur saw descending towards the earth. And it is somewhat curious that these 3 lines contain all the elements of the Bardic alphabet, as there is not a single letter in it that it is not formed from them. No less singular is it that this alphabet, which is alleged to have been only used upon wood, perhaps also implied by the 3 rods, is so constructed as altogether to avoid horizontal or circular lines, which could not be cut on wooden rods without splintering or running on account of the grain of the wood. So this is a very, very elaborate mythological origin story that Iolo has constructed here. It's very seductive. It's also very much made up. But Lloyd Alexander, of course, weren't to know this. And that's the problem often with these transmissions, is that the fantasy author is taking their source at face value. At first glance, it looks like what Lloyd Alexander has done here is taken Iolo's fanciful story and transformed it into a divination ritual. The 3 ash rods become Henwen's letter sticks, and the rest follows. But I think there's a more complicated process of adaptation here, bringing together the Coelbren and the Ogham letters. As I showed you earlier, Yolos alphabet was to be written and read horizontally and was engraved in small wooden rods or sticks presented in a wooden frame the size of an abacus. The letter sticks Dalben brings are much longer to begin with. He's carrying them to Henwen's pen on his bony shoulders. What's even more important, he then plants them upright in the earth, i.e. gets them to stand vertically. And then we see Henwen walking around them and pointing to symbols with her snout. The assumption here is that the writing on the rod is vertical and that the rods themselves are sort of person-sized. And this sounds to me like an interesting combination of an Ogham inscribed stone, most of them are roughly person-sized and of course feature the hallmark vertical writing, and the material of Yolos alphabet, i.e. carving on wood rather than stone, and linking those rods with the fanciful story of the 3 rods that represent the 3 rays of light. The fact that the rods explode and splinter before the prophecy is completed is here another sign of the powerful magic of these artifacts. What we realize later is that Henwen attempted to prophesy the end of magic in Prydain. The Prydain series ends in a very Tolkienian way. Prydain is saved from the forces of evil, but enchantment and magic are lost too. No wonder the letter sticks, the very embodiment of magic here, refuse to contemplate their own demise, and they explode, they split. This hybrid use of Ogham in Lloyd Alexander's Prydain, in which neither the term Ogham nor the term Coelbren are explicitly used, is something we'll see again in my last text. But let me move on now from children's fantasy in the 60s and 70s to the early 2000s and 2 novels for young adults or adults. And the first one is Catherine Fisher's Dark Hinge. The setting of this story is Avebury in Wiltshire, the location of probably the best known prehistoric stone circle after Stonehenge. The novel centers on 2 teenage siblings, Rob and Chloe. As the novel opens, Rob has to descend to an underworld, the Welsh Annwn, the unworld, via the upside-down oak tree in the middle of Catherine Fisher's imaginary Timberhenge in Avebury. And what he does that, he descends into the underworld to save his sister Chloe, who, following an accident, is lying in a hospital bed in a coma. Rob's guide in this catabasis, in this sort of descent to the underworld, is Vetch. And Vetch is a mysterious druid who is clearly modeled upon Taliesin, the visionary poet or bard of the Welsh tradition. Now, I won't go into the whole story of how straightforward it is actually to identify Vetch as Taliesin. You know, there's all sorts of descriptions and physical transformations that he goes through that follow pretty closely, actually, the Welsh tale of Taliesin, which Lady Guest included in her Mabinogion translation. So all of that is in my book. What is significant here for our topic is that Fisher brings another Welsh text into the mix, and here's where the links with Ogham come in. And I'm referring to the Cad Godai here, the Battle of the Trees. This is a poem of 250 lines, the central section of which tells the story of a battle fought by a formation of 34 species of trees and shrubs, actually. It's preserved in the Llyfr Taliesin, the Book of Taliesin, which contains around 60 poems attributed to Taliesin. The trees and shrubs that go to war in the poem are anthropomorphized as warriors and are described with standard phrases from heroic poetry, some of them hyperbolic or even comic. The Taliesin persona in these poems is one of learned boastfulness. As Margaret Haycock's recent scholarship has shown, Taliesin's poems are full of classical references to, say, Ovid's Metamorphoses, to the medieval learned tradition. You know, there's references there to Isidore de Seville's writings, as well as to Christian scripture. So these poems are really addressed to an elite, educated medieval audience. However, Taliesin has been interpreted very differently in modern popular receptions of the Welsh material. Enter Robert Graves again. Yes, it was always going to come to that. In Robert Graves' The White Goddess, Taliesin is a far more mysterious figure. He's the remnant of an ancient Druidic religion, and his visionary poems are part of a mystical tradition that retained the worship of the goddess, transmitting it even in Christian times via obscure cryptic poetry. We know that Fisher read Graves, and that she also read John Matthews' book on Taliesin, which extends Graves' ideas and makes Taliesin the custodian of a shamanic tradition. He becomes a shaman of sorts. Now, the Battle of the Trees was one of the fundamental texts for Robert Graves as well, for his mythological imaginings, and an important part of his argument for his ancient triple goddess. So Graves linked the trees that go to battle in the Battle of the Trees with a supposed secret code in which trees are assumed to stand for letters. Now, remember that some of the Ogham letters have tree names, as I mentioned earlier. Well, Graves argued that each tree stands for an Ogham letter, and each letter is associated with a period in the year. And you can see sort of the dates really here. His claim was that the poem concealed the secret calendar of the goddess worship. Graves's notion that the trees of the Battle of the Trees stand for letters came from a much earlier scholar, actually, Edward Celtic Davis. But it was Graves who linked the supposed letters in the Cad Godai with the Irish Ogham alphabet specifically, under the influence of actually an Irish scholar, McAllister, who claimed that all Ogham letters were named after trees. In fact, as I said earlier, Ogham letters are given different names from one source to another, and not all of them are names of trees. Also, just to remind you that this was a script used for a highly practical purpose, you know, land designation and memorials, rather than any mystical purposes. But there we go. Still, Graves' very influential book, which so many fantasy authors read, established this equation: trees in the Battle of the Trees equals Ogham letters. To complicate things, Graves also took up and extended another idea by Edward Davis. He argued that in the poem, the battle that the trees are fighting was actually a battle fought intellectually in the heads and with the tongues of the learned. It was a metaphor, not a real battle, but an intellectual battle. A battle, actually, he said, to defend and transmit the ancient Druidic religion encoded by the tree alphabet, here equated with the Ogham, against the Christian church. Fisher takes up this idea of an intellectual battle, but instead of a conflict between a pagan goddess worship and Christianity, she reappropriates this Battle of the Trees to portray sibling rivalry and express Chloe's frustration and anger, because her creativity as a poet, she's writing poetry, goes unnoticed and unrecognized, because in her family, she's overshadowed by her brother Rob, who is an artist, he paints. So bearing all of this in mind, let's have a look at an extract from Dark Hinge. At a pivotal moment in the book, Vetch, that's our Taliesin character, tries to wake up Chloe from her coma by a strange ritual that involves Ogham. It all happens in a hospital room, so a very sort of modern environment. So Vetch opens his crane bag, and the inspiration for this object is another long story I don't have time to go into. Anyway, bear with me. He opens his crane bag, and out of it come Ogham inscribed sticks. And that's what's going on. What is that? Rob asked. The crane skin bag. It contained words, all a poet needs. He opened the drawstring neck and tipped out some small sticks onto the bed. Rob came closer. The shaven twigs were about 3 inches long and looked like hazel because some of the bark was still on the back of them. Each had a side sliced smooth, and into each edge were cut a series of stiff angular lines, some horizontal, others leaning. What are they? Vetch glanced up. Letters. The alphabet is an ancient one called Ogham. Then Vetch starts talking about the unworld, the underworld, while Rob starts hearing all around him whispers in a strange language, and the words seem to come alive, fluttering around the room. So we go into this sort of shamanic ritual. And what happens next is this. Vetch had glanced around the room. Now, he lifted the vase of flowers. Remember, we're in a hospital, right? So he literally takes, the vase of flowers and took the circular woven placemat from underneath. He placed the mat on the bed, took one of the small sticks and pushed the base in so that it stood upright. Very slightly, the murmur in the air modulated. Vetch slotted a second notched twig into the base. Now, Vetch continues to speak about the unworld while manipulating the sticks, and the words around them become louder and louder. A third twig stood upright. Rob felt the darkness gather. Behind him, curtains drifted, a soft touch on his arm. Sounds whispered and crisped like wings. He took a step closer. Stay back, carefully listening intently. Vetch put in another twig, then another. They had begun to make a tiny wooden circle round the circumference of the placemat. The notched shaven wood close together, the words a rampart. He was recreating the henge. So as Vetch continues to try to form a miniature henge with the Ogham sticks, the voices all around become gradually louder, more delirious. It looks like he's trying to complete the circle, which he hopes will wake Chloe from her coma. But the last twigs seem to resist his fingers. They don't want to comply and form the circle. Rob has to help, but by the time they're done, the machines in Chloe's hospital room start beeping all at once, and the doctor and nurses walk in and interrupt the ritual. So it's never quite completed, never manages to do its job. Now Vetch knows that the only solution is for Rob to go physically down into the unworld and save his sister. So what we have here is a highly imaginative combination of Graves' theories, the popular link of the Celtic past with structures such as Stonehenge or Avebury, and a sort of a healing spell really here. The Ogham letters are here carved on small sticks or twigs, which may originally bring to mind actually Yolos Alphabet. But of course, the moment these sticks are made to stand upright, creating a miniature Stonehenge structure, they are also become symbolic tiny versions of a series of Ogham engraved standing stones, forming a stone circle. The carving of the Ogham letters here, specifically named Ogham, is exactly the way he would expect them. They're carved into the edge of each stick, and they're a series of stiff angular lines. If Vetch hadn't been interrupted, this ritual may have brought Chloe back. The power of the Ogham letters is in their power to communicate with the unworld and those trapped there in our case. But they have another power too. At the beginning of the sequence I just quoted, Vetch says that his crane bag contains words all a poet needs. By the end of the story, we also find out that this crane bag of Ogham sticks of words is what Vetch, our Taliesin character, stole from the goddess Ceridwen, Graves' goddess and the main female antagonist in the story. The Ogham sticks, therefore, also represent poetic inspiration in this novel. And this inspiration is offered at the conclusion of the story to Chloe, who aspires to be a poet. Right, let me turn to my last sort of main text now, and that is Patricia McKillip's The Bottlebone Plane. The Bottlebone Plane was published in 2010 and was nominated and shortlisted for several fantasy awards. The main plot is set in a half-medieval, half-modern world. There is a monarchy, there's a king, there are bards who have to train for years and years to memorize lines and lines of verses and folk ballads by heart. All of this sort of echoes a medieval bardic practice. But there are also trams and cars, and archaeology is an important academic discipline. To be honest, I don't think that the cover does a very good job of sort of rendering this mixed medieval and modern world, but there we go. So at the opening of the story, in an archaeological site in the main land, we are, Cairo, the kingdom of Cairo, Princess Beatrice, the king's youngest daughter, helps uncover ancient ruins under the directorship of polymath master Jonah Clay. At the same time, Jonah's son, Phelan, struggles to find an essay topic for his graduation essay from the College of Bards. Sounds like my students at the moment getting very worried about their dissertation topics. That's exactly what's happening here. This is the storyline now in the world's present. But interweaved with this, we have a storyline of the past. 1,000 years earlier, the peasant Nairn sees the powerful Declan wielding bardic magic to aid his king's invasion of the individual kingdoms of what will become the land of Cairo in the future. So 1,000 years, two storylines, 1,000 years between them. Nairn finds himself at Declan's newly founded Bardic College, the one from which Phelan is graduating 1,000 years later, and he's caught up in Declan's search for the land's own magic, lost 1,000 years earlier still, and now existing only in glimpses of folk memory, in riddles, in songs, and in a mysterious ancient language written in strange symbols. Now, both in the story's present and in Nairn's past, there is a contest, a competition is held to appoint the new royal bard. And in both timelines, a stranger appears as if from nowhere, possessing music and poetry skills that make him seemingly unbeatable. The stranger carries a harp with strange symbols carved on it. Nairn's attempt to best the stranger in the story's past results in a disaster that will haunt him down the centuries. So in the story's present, it seems that a similar disaster is imminent. Will the past repeat itself? How is Phelan and his friend Zoe, who's competing for the royal bard post, and Princess Beatrice, who becomes Phelan's lover, and Jonah going to escape from being trapped into a reiteration of this catastrophic past? So I won't give you the ending. This is sort of setting up the story. I will let you discover this for yourselves. But naturally, I want to focus on that mysterious, powerful ancient language and its strange script, which of course seems to be evoking the Ogham symbols. When Princess Beatrice first unearths examples of this writing, the symbols are described in various ways. They are like broken twigs or twiggy things or hen scratches or a few stray twiggy ink scratches or the twig words. Every now and then they're also called runes, using a staple term for writing systems in fantasy literature, popularized by Tolkien and widely used in post-Tolkienian fantasy and gaming. But these are not really runes. The term is used, I think, as a shorthand to convey a particular visual aesthetic that most fantasy fans will recognize. The point here is that this is a script made up of straight lines of twigs combined into different patterns. And there are plenty of other well-hidden, I think, Celtic elements in the text to make this connection more secure. So, for example, one of the ancient riddles in this Ogham-like script talks about the 3 trials of Bone Plane: the oracular stone, the inexhaustible cauldron, the turning tower. This is a triad made out of disparate bits and pieces of Irish and Welsh material, such as the 4 treasures of the Tuatha De Danann or the 13 treasures of the island of Britain. Tellingly, it seems that in that fantasy world, this script was originally found on standing stones. That is its origin. And that's the last 2 sort of extracts in this slide. That's the ancient way of writing, says a secondary character in the story's past. I don't know it, though I've seen it here and there, carved into standing stones. When Declan talks to Nairn about the riddle of Bone Plane, which structures the entire plot of the novel, really, he says that it is, quote, perhaps the oldest poem in Belden. I found it on a standing stone during King Oro's first battle on Stirl Plain. Declan also tells Nairn that this is not just a script, and that's where things get a bit more interesting, not just a writing system. The ancient examples on the standing stones also reveal an entire primeval language, the language of secrets, the language of power, the language of lost art, says Declan. The mysterious bard who appears out of nowhere to sing in the bardic competition can not only read the script, but he can speak this original ancient language, which sounds guttural and incomprehensible. Declan is astounded. You speak it, he says. You know how it sounds. But even words of Nairn's mother tongue, when written in this script, seem to go deep into the primeval meaning of ordinary words, such as bread or fire or ice. Nairn manages to master the power of this writing, and he wakes up deeper meanings in words of his own language, but he loses control of the words and he causes an accident. At the same time, the mysterious bard's harp is scored with the same strange symbols, and Nairn finds out eventually that it is music that brings symbols and meanings together and unleashes each word's power. The symbols on the harp seem to me to be another emulation of the ogham carved on wood this time, and this is how they're described. The scores on the harp were deliberate, he saw, made with a knife. Then the lines arranged themselves into some very familiar patterns, and Nairn's thoughts froze. Later on, the bard is described as the mysterious harper who knew the language of the standing stones and had carved it into his harp. So here again, we have a transfer of this ogham-like script from standing stones originally to wood later on. Nairn also notices that common people use some of these ancient twig symbols without necessarily knowing or remembering what they mean, out of habit. One particular example may well point to a hybridization in McKillip's story between the ogham and, again, Iolo Morgana's Bardic alphabet. Nairn sees something significant when he observes a young girl making bread. He stood there, chewing absently, watching her as she shook a lump of dough from a bowl, dropped it onto a patch of flour on the table, and pummeled it down with her fingers until it lay round and plump as a cushion. She took a knife to it, slashed it delicately with one long line across its surface and a shorter line to each side of that. 3 twigs, he realized slowly, in the ancient pattern for bread. Do you know what that means? He asked abruptly. Those lines? She considered them, then him, her dark brows peaked. My grandmother always does that, she explained. To me, it means bread. On the story's present timeline, Princess Beatrice and Phelan encounter the same symbol, but Phelan now knows what it is. What does it mean? Princess Beatrice asks. Bread. Bread? Look in any bakery, you see the pattern still used on cottage loaves. So this is, it's continued just out of practice, really. It's, the meaning has been forgotten, but the practice is still there. This symbol becomes one that Nairn uses later on to identify other people who can also recognize this language, these twig symbols. The symbol for bread is described again later on in the text as follows. The 3 parallel lines, the middle one longer at both ends than the outer pair, in the ancient word for bread. Now, the picture I've got here on the right is not a perfect match because they're not parallel lines, they're sort of diverging, but I couldn't help it really brought it to my mind. This is Iolo Morgana's Bardic symbol, the 3 rods of ash, the 3 rays of light, the same symbol I discussed earlier in relation to Hen Wen's letter sticks in Lloyd Alexander's Prydain. In the Bottlebone Plane, the narrator's voice even tells us that sometimes this symbol would appear as an etching on the frontispiece of a book. And here are 3 books from the Iolo and post-Iolo period, which are about bardic matters and which all carry the bardic symbol in their titles. Not by frontispieces, but still. In the Bottlebone Plane, then, the ogham alphabet becomes a mystical script that transmits ancient knowledge of the magic and power of language itself. This is the only example I've given you so far where a fantasy ogham-like alphabet is actually inscribed on standing stones. So we're nicely coming back full circle to where this paper began, the actual real-world ogham stones. Now, I'd like to draw together some threads out of these case studies, if I may. We had a look at the ogham-like script in the manuscript that reveals the secret message of the Grail in Susan Cooper's The Darkest Rising series. The letter sticks engraved with ogham-like symbols used for divination via the oracular pig Hen Wen in Lloyd Alexander's Chronicles of Prydain. The actual ogham letters engraved on small twigs, which are used to create a miniature model of a standing stone circle and heal a young girl out of a coma in Catherine Fisher's Darkhenge, and an ogham-like script on standing stones and hidden away in structures and artifacts throughout the land, unleashing, if one knows how to read it, the power of language to make or break things in Patricia McKillip's The Bottlebone Plane. In all 4 of my texts, we see the pan-Celticism I identified when discussing Susan Cooper's example. The Irish ogham are mixed up with other folkloric and mythological motifs from the Irish and the Welsh tradition and other things as well, and often also with invented traditions of the Celtomania period, such as Iolo's made-up alphabet. All 4 of my texts also resist the real-world, intensely practical use of the ogham in their original context. As we said, they were used in monuments to commemorate people or designate land boundaries. Instead, in fantasy, we have indeed magic writing. These fantasy ogham and ogham-like scripts are ciphers conveying ancient secrets, or their divination tools, or healing devices, or talismans that can awaken the hidden powers of language. Fantasy ogham, therefore, are most definitely on the romantic side of Celticity. In all four texts, too, the ogham are related with special magical religious people, be they enchanters, or druids, or bards, or iterations of King Arthur's Merlin, and often associated with stone circles like Stonehenge or Avebury. Once more, we're in romantic territory, when the ogham had been associated with the druids, and stone circles were part of this popular perception of Celticity. Last but not least, I'm seeing here an interesting pattern, though I do know that my sample here is pretty small and I don't want to overgeneralize. Out of my four texts, two are intrusion fantasies. So the Dark is Rising and Dark Henge are intrusion fantasies because they're set in our world, the real world, the primary world, in which mythical and supernatural forces intrude and which they disrupt. So in those texts, the ogham alphabet is named as such. Merriman Lyon says that the symbols on the manuscript are something like an ancient alphabet called Ogham. And Vetch uses nearly exactly the same words, but there's no like in his versions. The letters on his hazel sticks are actually part of the ancient alphabet called Ogham, he says. The other two of my texts are immersive fantasies, texts that construct an entire imaginary secondary world. So Prydain is the world of Lloyd Alexander's series, while in MacKillip's novel we have the invented kingdom and land of Kairai. It makes sense, therefore, that the name Ogham itself is not mentioned in these books. We can't have a real world term in a fantasy land. That would create all sorts of potential inconsistencies, or would imply a direct link with the primary world that the author clearly does not wish. We are left to infer the presence of Ogham-like scripts from the descriptions and attributes. So the creative strategies of using Ogham in fantasy, therefore, have to fit with a particular subcategory of the genre and its aesthetics and its expectations, as well as with a more general tendency to invest this highly ingenious and practical alphabet with powerful magic. And talking about strategies and fantasy subgenres, I promised you some Terry Pratchett right at the beginning. So let me finish this paper with a very fleeting, the one very fleeting reference to Ogham in the invented world of Terry Pratchett, and that's Discworld. And that's from, the example I've got here is from Lords and Ladies. So in Lords and Ladies, the inimitable Nanny Ogg, a recurring witch character in Discworld novels, arrives together with Cousin Unda the dwarf to an old burial mound, the Long Mound, deep inside the primeval forest. Well, it's not just one burial mound, actually. Let me read you the extract, which is a bit long, but worth it, trust me. Nanny let the broomstick glide to a halt. There, she said, pushing aside a bracken frond, the Long Man. Cousin Unda peered under her elbow. Is that all? It's just an old burial mound. 3 old burial mounds, said Nanny. Cousin Unda took in the overgrown landscape. Yes, I see them, he said. 2 round ones and a long one. Well, the first time I saw them from the air, said Nanny, I nearly fell off the bloody broomstick for laughing. There was one of those pauses known as the delayed drop, while the dwarf worked out the topography of the situation. Then, blimey, said Cousin Unda, I thought the people who built burial mounds and earthworks and things were serious druids and people like that, not people who drew on privy walls with 200,000 tons of earth in a manner of speaking. Doesn't sound like you to be shocked by that sort of thing. She could have sworn the dwarf was blushing under his wig. Well, there's such a thing as style, said Cousin Unda. There's such a thing as subtlety. You don't just shout, I've got a great big tonka. It's a bit more complicated than that, said Nanny, pushing through the bushes. Here is the landscape saying, I've got a great big tonka. Tonka, that's a dwarf word, isn't it? Yes, it's a good word. Cousin Unda tried to untangle himself from a briar. Esme doesn't come up here. Esme is another recurring character in the Discworld world. Esme doesn't come out here, said Nanny from somewhere up ahead. She says it's bad enough about folk songs and maypoles and such like, without the whole scenery getting suggestive. Of course, she went on, this was never intended as a women's place. My great-grand said, in the real old days, the men used to come up for strange rites that no women ever saw. See, she said they just used to build sweat lodges and smell like a blacksmith's armpit and drink scumble and dance around the fire with horns on and piss in the trees any old how, said Nanny. She said it was a bit sissy, to be honest, but I always reckon a man's got to be a man, even if it is sissy. What happened to your wig? I think it's on that tree back there. Still got the crowbar? Yes, Mrs. Ogg. Here we are then. They had arrived at the foot of the Long Mound. There were 3 large irregular stones here, forming a low cave. Nanny Ogg ducked under the lintel into the fusty and somewhat ammonia-scented darkness. How about here would do, she said. Got a match? The sulphurous glow revealed a flat rock with a crude drawing scratched on it. Ochre had been rubbed into the lines. They showed a figure of an old-eyed man wearing an animal skin and horns. In the flickering light, he seemed to dance. There was a runic inscription underneath. Anyone ever worked out what that says? Said Cousin Unda. Nanny Ogg nodded. It's a variety of Ogham, she said. Basically, it means, I've got a great big tonka. Ogham, said the dwarf. My family has been in these, how shall I put it, in these parts for a very long time, said Nanny. Knowing you is a real education, Mrs. Ogg, said Cousin Unda. Well, this is classic Terry Pratchett. This is a humorous, satiric, ludic fantasy, clearly taking the mick out of the romanticized ideas of the ancient past as mystical, mysterious, and mystifying. Pratchett's variant spelling of the Ogham as Ogham, G-G-H-A-M, clearly, but also playfully, connects the alphabet with Nanny Ogg's family. So they are Ogham belonging, sort of developed by her ancestors or whatever. But both the landscape and the Ogham inscription here cater to those sorts of rude, but also universally recognizable human instincts. In some ways, Pratchett's fantasy takes the mick out of all the other fantasy texts I've discussed today, critiquing their romanticized views of Celticity, and rudely but surely returns us to a rather more practical use of the Ogham. Thank you very much.